Good morning, students. I hope this finds you well and safe. This lecture is for April 27th or 28th, depending on which U.S. history class you're in. We were talking about President Bush when we left off last time. And of course, the Bush administration had already had two serious hits. One, of course, was 9/11, shortly after he took office. The other was the fiasco of Hurricane Katrina. Well, if that wasn't enough, between 1997 and 2006, home prices in the United States rose about 85%. Leading to a frenzy of irresponsible mortgage lending for purchasing of homes. What they came up with was a subprime loan. A person might be able to pay, say, a mortgage for a $125,000 home. But these mortgage lenders would come along and encourage them to buy a $175,000 or $200,000 loan, and they would lower the normal premiums for a few years. And so you paid the lower premium, and you were able to get into a little bit better home than you might have gotten otherwise. But then after the assigned period, the mortgage would go up to the normal price for that type of mortgage. And so by 2007, the housing bubble burst. Home values, housing sales began to plummet. Record numbers of people defaulted on their mortgage payments, and foreclosures and bankruptcies soared, and banks lost millions. Now, let's use some common sense here. Many of these people were paying the lower mortgage payment. They were meeting their monthly obligations. But then when the payments were raised, they were unable to meet those obligations. But instead of banks and financial companies working with them, they decided to foreclose. So the banks were then receiving no money. And the people that had been living in the home were, of course, evicted from the home. And so because some common sense wasn't used, a lot of homes sat empty. A lot of people lost their homes. And so it was a thing that plunged the U.S. economy into a huge recession by 2008. And it quite honestly caught a whole lot of people by surprise. And so the price of food, the price of gasoline soared, unemployment skyrocketed, consumer indebtedness rose, and President Bush was, of course, blamed for the problem. Now, he did sign a law to help banks, but quite honestly, little of the money that banks had actually got to the people that needed it, nor did it restore confidence in the American economy, because the banks just simply would not loan money to rescue homeowners. And so you have bonuses being paid by many of these banks to their CEOs, but they in turn would not turn around and loan the money that they could have and should have loaned to the consumers. And of course, Bush's popularity fell to historic lows, and U.S. moral lay in ruins. Was the American dream over? Owning a home? Was it done as a result of this? And what was horrific about all of this is the great amount of unemployment that existed, as about 9 million people were out of work for a time. And so with all of this going on, for the election of 2008, the Democrats really felt they had a chance. And the front runner was former President Bill Clinton's wife, Hillary. But she was overconfident, striving very, very hard to be the first woman president of the United States. And she was upset by a first-term senator, Barack Obama of Illinois. People wanted change. People didn't want experience. They wanted somewhat of a Washington outsider. And Obama fit that description in many, many ways. Because, number one, he was the first African-American presidential candidate from either party. He was an excellent speaker, and his opponent, who was John McCain, and John McCain had served in the Senate for years and years. He was a Vietnam veteran and hero of the Vietnam War, but he was at that time the oldest candidate in history, and he ran a really lackluster campaign. It was like he knew the Republicans didn't stand a chance. And so the Democrats will not only win the presidency, but they will win majorities in both houses. So the Republicans really took a kick as a result of the 2008 presidential election. Now, Obama did continue the bailout system that Bush had started. It did not create new jobs. And so Obama and Congress will pass an economic stimulus bill, and the bill gave cash distributions to states for construction projects and so on to work on the nation's infrastructure. It was a very scaled down version of what FDR had tried to do during the Great Impression. But by June of 2009, unemployment in the United States had hit 9.5%. Two of the three big automakers also had to be bailed out by the government, GM and Chrysler. Ford did not take a loan at this time. Now, to the credit of both automakers, they ultimately repaid their loans. But this, in 2009, was the largest spending package stimulus in history to that point in time. And from the get-go, Obama wanted to revamp health care. And so he will bring about a health care bill that will be bitterly debated both among Republicans and Democrats, but Democrats as well, that would provide lower income Americans with federal subsidies to be able to pay their coverage, and that insurance companies could no longer deny coverage to people with pre-existing conditions, which had been a big way of excluding a lot of people from the healthcare system. Everyone except the wealthy would pay higher, or not except the wealthy, but even more so the wealthy, would pay higher Medicare payroll taxes to help fund these changes. But according to President Obama, no one would have to give up their current insurance. And as it turned out, this was just simply not true. Millions of Americans wound up losing coverage for them and their families. And so the big contention of the law was forcing all Americans to have health insurance. One way or the other, you had to have it. And there was even a place on the federal income tax where you had to verify that you did have this insurance. Now, from the time it was rolled out in 2013, it was a disaster. Computers crashed, people had problems. It was a terrible, terrible startup. And then, of course, as we said, a lot of people did have to change their insurance company because they lost their coverage. Well, while this is going on, in July of 2011, the U.S. Space Shuttle program finally came to an end with the landing of the last space shuttle, and they were retired. Now, what this did was now create a situation where to get American astronauts to the International Space Station, we have to hook a ride with the Russians. Because at the moment, they are the only ones providing, shall we say, shuttle service to the International Space Station. So yes, following the fall of the Soviet Union, ultimately the United States and Russia have been able to come together and work together in a space program. And normally there's always going to be at least a Russian and at least an American, not counting other foreign nationals who might go, who are going to be on the International Space Station at any particular time. And there have been people who have stayed up there for as long as a year now. And science experiments are going on, all kinds of things are happening on the International Space Station. Currently, there are some private companies, one of them known as SpaceX, who is trying to develop a space program from the private sector. And in doing so, they want to have reusable booster rockets. And they have been quite successful in some of their tests of launching an object into space and being able to land on a platform the booster rockets that took it up to space. Well, obviously, if you can reuse these things, there can be a tremendous saving. And so it is going to the point that much space exploration, though NASA still exists, much of the space exploration now is being experimented with some private companies. Okay. Obviously, Obamacare went to the Supreme Court. And in a 5-4 ruling, most of the new federal law was declared to be constitutional. And so Obamacare became the system that has dominated the United States healthcare system since that time. We have an act in July of 2010 to once again regulate Wall Street, and part of this act was to try to protect consumers from unfair practices in loans and credit cards that wanted to charge exorbitant interest rates of its consumers. And so there was a Consumer Financial Protection Agency that came out as a result of that. Okay. Obama did continue the practice that the U.S. would be the principal police force, so to speak, quote, air quotes, in the world. And then by the end of 2011, he begins to withdraw U.S. combat troops from Iraq. And by December of 2011, all combat troops were out of Iraq. But let's realize the government that was in place was not always the most friendly to the United States, as we might imagine. So while he was reducing in Iraq, we had another surge in Afghanistan. And the surge somewhat helped. Supposedly the last combat troops left Afghanistan in 2014, but there have still been U.S. troops that are there, have had to engage in military combat, and Afghanistan just seems to be the war that will not go away. Okay, as we mentioned, in May 2011, a U.S. Navy SEAL team killed Osama bin Laden, and a very wise thing was done. They took his body and dumped it at sea. They did not bury it, because had they done so, his place of burial would have become a martyr's tomb for every fanatical, radical Muslim that lived. And so that was the wisest thing that could be done. Take the body, dump it at sea where nobody knows where it is, and that keeps that martyr's tomb from ever building up. Okay, during 2010, 2011, there were some spontaneous eruptions, a lot of it Democratic, much of it young people who were very computer savvy. It has been called the Arab Awakening, the Arab Spring. One by one, a lot of tyrants were shaken by this, from Tunisia to Algeria, Bahrain, Jordan, Morocco, Egypt, Oman, Yemen, Libya, Saudi Arabia, and even Syria. Of course, what will terribly happen in Syria is it will erupt into a civil war that has turned out to be a humanitarian disaster. It has just been horrific. There are awful camps in which people are having to live, and they're living in tents with few amenities, and it is just a terrible, terrible thing. And at the moment, that civil war is still going on in Syria. And the so-called president of Syria is bombing his own people and sending his military in to aid them. And as a result of that, Russia has kind of come in to help out a little bit, because Russia definitely wants to try to establish itself in a positive way in the Middle East so it can have a greater influence on oil prices. Well, Obama became a terribly polarizing president. And it was found that the Republicans were not going to negotiate with him. So, the stalemate that had existed in Congress actually became worse. And that stalemate, with a couple of exceptions here recently with the C-19 and so on, that stalemate has continued in Congress. If one party proposes it, it seems as if the other party is automatically against it, and vice versa. And so it is a sad, sad thing. Now, in the 2010 midterm elections, there were a lot of long-standing congressional leaders, and this is both Democrat and Republicans, that wound up being kicked out of office. And the House will actually be captured by the Republicans as a result of that. And each side will refuse to negotiate or compromise. And so from 2010, there was actually no meaningful action on the economy, joblessness, or a federal budget deficit. In fact, that 2010 Congress became one of the most ineffective that had ever existed in the nation's history. And as a result of that, American confidence in Congress has continued to decline. And that is true today. Not a lot of Americans have a really, really positive outlook on the idea of what Congress is trying to accomplish. Now, in 2010, Congress will take a significant step toward equal treatment of the gays. And as a result of changing attitudes in Congress, changing attitudes among young people, it almost came to be that the only sin that existed in the United States was that of intolerance. A lot more people were tolerating it. And of course, finally, in 2012, Obama will announce his support for the right of gay and lesbian couples to marry. And in 2015, the Supreme Court will grant that right. And the greatest nightmare of the founders came to pass. Excuse me. Of everything the founders proposed in the Constitution, the thing they were most afraid of was the Supreme Court. They were afraid that one day the Supreme Court, quite contrary to the Constitution, would become a lawmaking institution. And in 2015, that happened. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court tried to tell the United States in his dissenting letter that that's exactly what happened. But yet, Congress was so divided among itself that no one raised an objection. And as many of you know, if somebody gets away with something, they will generally try to get away with something else later on down the road. So there are a lot of Americans cautiously watching the Supreme Court, wondering when the next law-making decision may come along. Well, during the Obama administration, as we have seen throughout many administrations, we have the problem of immigration. And there have been many individuals from Latin America that had illegally, sneakily, if that's a word, come into the United States. And so the Obama administration will put what's called a DREAM Act into effect. The parents could be punished for their illegal entry into the United States, but their children could not. And of course, the way the act was written and the way it's been worked has probably created a whole lot more problems than it solved. And so as we look at immigration today, there are people backed up at the Mexican border trying to get into the United States. There are people illegally trying to cross into the United States. And Congress is going to have to be able to come together and come up with a sensible, compassionate immigration bill. So far, they haven't been able to do so. But the only way immigration is ever going to be solved is that way. Well, the 2012 presidential election turned out to be the most expensive election ever in history to that point in time. Mitt Romney won the Republican presidential nomination, and he had several things that really hurt him. First, he was going to please the right-wing anti-immigration people completely. Second, in an open mic goof, he basically said 47% of Americans failed to take responsibility for their life anyway, and he wasn't worried about their votes. And so he will suffer defeat. There was actually a third thing that hurt Romney. And yes, once again, religion played a factor. There were many Republicans who simply stayed at home because of Romney's religious affiliation. They weren't going to vote for a Democrat, but they weren't going to vote for Romney because of his Mormon association. And so Obama will win a second term. And his Affordable Care Act will continue to be a massive problem. It was complicated. And then as he begins his second term, he's got several scandals that he must deal with. The IRS had been targeting conservative groups, and this came out. The NSA had been spying on U.S. citizens, and the murder and cover-up of that murder of some U.S. diplomats in Benghazi. Now, the interesting thing about this, when Obama defeated Clinton, he made her Secretary of State, and this debacle in Benghazi took place under her watch. And of course, she's going to be heavily criticized because she was using a private cell phone to do most of her business. And so a lot of problems were plaguing Obama. And by November 2013, you had 57% of voters saying that they did not approve of Obamacare anymore. And there will be a lawsuit filed against President Obama, and even talk of impeachment at the same time. Well, if these internal problems weren't enough, Iran in the Middle East was doing all that it could to develop nuclear weapons. And that would totally, absolutely, 1 billion% destabilize the area. Iran was helping with the civil war in Syria, and Iran was helping finance terrorism in the nation of Israel. And so in 2014, an ultra-militant group appeared. It had actually started its rise about 1999. It came to us known as ISIS, and they wanted to build a caliphate, an independent, radical Muslim state using portions of Iraq, Syria, and other places. And so we're trying to reduce the threat of Iran. And so John Kerry, the Secretary of State, will agree to an agreement with a lot of European nations, with Iran, that was probably one of the worst deals the United States ever engaged in. Probably the only one any worse was the one with Britain just before the War of 1812 broke out. And many Americans thought that Kerry had literally sold the country out. Of course, one of President Trump's first things is going to be to get us out of that. Okay, so we've got that problem. We've got Russia as a problem. Putin, the president of Russia, has figured out how to maneuver that country. And quite honestly, Putin is quite popular. Russia's used to autocrats. They had them with the czars. They had them during the communist regime. And so the iron hand of Putin is, to them, nothing new, nothing strange. And Putin wants to make Russia a major, major player in the world once again. And so he has served as president, he served as prime minister, he's back in as president, and he keeps figuring out ways to keep himself in power. And Russia is a competitor. We may be getting along in the space program, but there are other areas we're not. And nations like Russia and China would like to see nothing more than for the United States to somehow stumble and perhaps even fall. And so, yes, Putin talks a good talk, but United States presidents have got to keep a very leery eye on him. And like Stalin in World War II, he cannot be fully trusted whatsoever. He has annexed some territory in Crimea. He has interfered in eastern Ukraine. And so far, all that has been done is some economic repercussions against the Russians so far. As I say, Russia's helping the Syrian leadership, and they would love nothing more than to play a major role in world politics and, if possible, become a superpower with the United States once again. But let's realize, as we look at our world today, the Middle East continues to be one of those very volatile regions of the world. To me, in many respects, it's like Europe just before World War I. What is it going to take to set off an explosion? And so that is an area we must continually watch. There's a lot of bold talk on the part of some nations and a lot of, shall we call, saber rattling and so on. And yet, it is an area that we must keep an eye on, because obviously a whole lot of the world's oil production comes out of here. Now, as we come to 2014, and we've talked about rich, poor, and the divide that has existed there throughout our studies, in 2014, the richest 1% of Americans controlled more than 20% of the entire income. And 46 million Americans were living below the official poverty line. And you can now imagine, with the current layoffs and everything else that have occurred as a result of C-19, many of those people that were just barely making it have been hurt tremendously bad by this current crisis. In most cases today, it takes 2 incomes for a family to be able to make it. Both man and woman are going to have to work to be able to afford things, because obviously the price of things have gone up. Okay, globalization of the economy as a result of computers, internets, has paid great dividends for the most wealthy. But right now, we see the effects of globalization. There are a lot of positive things that can happen. Trade's going on, all sorts of things were happening. But just as it has been in the historical past, for example, during the Black Death, plagues tend to follow trade routes. And with C-19, that's exactly what has happened. It followed the trade routes. Came out of China, went into Europe, went into Africa, came into the United States. And this is definitely a person-to-person transmitted disease. And it was transmitted because it was not gotten under control in the epicenter. And so people traveling for business and other reasons spread it throughout the world. And it is a problem right now today. It's what has had to cause us to change. Now, I will say there are some positive things that have come out of it. Number one, American humor is still alive and well. There are all kinds of individuals putting up little funny blurb that make fun of our current circumstances, shelter in place, and everything else, and they find ways to be funny about it. The other thing is a little more serious, but equally American, and that is that American genius has really come forward. There are American companies that have retooled themselves. The automobile industry making ventilators for hospitals, breweries making hand sanitizer, universities learning how to create and make face shields, individual Americans in their own homes while they're confined there, making masks for people to wear out in public. And so American creative genius has come out once again. And because of that, we will ultimately overcome this. But let's talk about a few other things. The election of 2016 was really a unique election. It pitted the two least popular candidates in American history, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. The campaign was negative. It was nasty. Both of them carried tons of baggage with them. And the surprise for almost everyone was the fact that Trump won the electoral vote while Clinton won the popular vote. Now, both were very close. But the white working class gave the election to Trump. Some of those former, what we would call Reagan Democrats, came back to play. It was really sad that the national news one night had a man, and I remember he was from Ohio, and he said in a nation of 330 billion people, these are the best two candidates we can come up with. And so this shows just how unpopular both were. But the political divide that existed before actually became more accentuated. It became even worse than it had been. And so most of Trump's early activity was through executive orders. The Republicans did pass a tax reduction bill in 2017. But President Trump had so riled individuals up that in December of 2019, he was impeached by House Democrats. And so Trump became the third president to be impeached by the House of Representatives. None were ever impeached by the Senate, but they were by the House. So, where's the United States today? I want to list some problems These are not necessarily in order, but they are problems that our great nation is facing, and we can't just stick our head in the sand. These are things we must confront. Number one, mass shootings and gang violence. You know, students, when I was in elementary and high school, I never had a thought that somebody was going to come into the school with a gun and shoot it up. Never thought of such a thing. That was not the world in which we lived. We live in a very angry world. And we live in a world where mental health is not being given much attention. And as a result of that, angry, isolated individuals can and do resort to violence. And then, of course, we have the gang problem. And why do we have these? Because young people feel hopeless. They don't feel they have a place. And so in a gang, they can be accepted. They have a place. And so we're going to have to come up with some programs that help provide young people with a sense of hope, with a sense of accomplishment. So hopefully they won't drift off and join these violent gangs. When we think about it, in 2016, there were over 700 murders in Chicago alone. That shouldn't be happening. We're a better nation than that. And we need to do something about that. Secondly, we have the manufacture and the use of illegal drugs. And we have an opioid abuse problem. Doctors writing open-end prescriptions, and should they be held accountable? Yes. By all means, they should. But, again, a sense of hopelessness prevails in a lot of these lives. And again, mental health, if it were improved in this country, could go a long way for helping toward getting people away from drugs and the activities that go with them. But we have Mexico trying to flow drugs into this country. A lot of the drugs are coming out of Central America. They're coming out of the Middle East. And as history has shown, the British were able to do a lot of damage and control in China by using drugs and getting the Chinese people hooked on drugs. So we really need to work on that. Okay, we still have a lot of poverty, especially among our minorities. And we need job training. We need job fairs. We need, as we have seen in the current crisis, to get people to work. There's a sense of accomplishment, a sense of fulfillment in having a job. Even if it's not the greatest job in the world, there's still a sense of that. And so we need to help people be able to help themselves. You know, there's an old expression, you give a person a fish, you feed them for a day, you teach them how to fish, you feed them for a lifetime. We have depression, and this is number 4, among many of our military veterans. And this is really sad, but some of our veterans have done 3 and 4 tours of duty in the Middle East. They've seen things that none of the rest of us have seen, And the suicide rate among our veterans right now is horrific. We need to improve the VA. We need to improve counseling. We need to do so much to help these individuals be able to transition back from a war mentality to a civilian life mentality once again. And counseling and mental health is going to go a whole long way in this. The VA has proved to be quite ineffective in the last few years, and it needs a tremendous amount of change and improvement. And probably a very logical thing would be, instead of requiring veterans to go to VA to get their medical treatment, is just give them a voucher and allow them to go to the doctor of their choice and get the treatment that they need for the various things. And hand in hand with veteran suicide is a lot of veterans are actually living in homeless conditions. They're not the only ones. And I will admit there are some people who choose to live that way. But I don't think most folks really set that as a goal when they're a teenager, that I want to be homeless when I'm in my 30s and 40s and 50s. And so you've got the homeless situation, and along with that situation, you have the emotional problems that go there. I mean, some people that are homeless are seriously mentally ill, and they really need some help. Well, obviously, number 6, national security. Freedom is not free, and the United States is always going to have to remain vigilant. We didn't in 1941, and it cost us tremendously. We didn't in 2011, and it cost us tremendously. We've got to be vigilant. And so it's going to be a necessity that the United States keep and well train a military and be able to provide protection not only for our own borders, but those with whom we are allied with, to help them protect their borders as well. Immigration, number 7, as we've talked about. Who's welcome? Who's not? We really need a modern, up-to-date, and dare I say this, bipartisan immigration plan. And it may well be that many of you, by your votes, some of you may decide to run for political office someday. You guys are going to have a big say in this. And so there needs to be a common sense, compassionate, wise program, not a bunch of knee-jerk reactions that have to be undone months or years after they're initially put into place. And so a lot of work needs to take place in the immigration debate. And number 8 of our big problems is, of course, the political stalemate. And you have people in both parties. As I said earlier, if someone in the other party suggests it, we're against it because it came out of the other party. And so we've got to figure out how to get people to be able to work together. Now, I will say during this current crisis, Congress woke up. Now, there was a lot of ugly debating going on between the two parties, but they finally came up with a couple of things to try to help American workers and hospital people and others out during this crisis. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could see that happening in so many other respects as well? And so, America, yep, it's a great nation. Is it perfect? No, because there are no perfect people. But it always has, and hopefully will continue to be, a sort of beacon in the world of the potential that a people who come together and work together, this is what they can help create. What's the future of America? I don't know. I don't know. What will your children see in an America? To a great extent, what you help make it to be. Now, my dad was not a great philosopher, but Dad brought my brother and myself up with a notion, and I thought it was awful wise. I still do, these many years later. He said, you can't change the world as an individual. He said, but you can make the world where you live a better place. And that sounds like a great, wise thing for all of us to think about. Students, I hope you've enjoyed the course. I have tried in these lectures to give you all the material I would have given you in the classroom if we were able to meet. By the way, if you haven't just figured it out, this will be our last lecture. The test will cover, we skipped one, I realize. The test will cover from World War II to the end of the book. And it will be discussion questions. It will be open book, open note. I'm trying to do that for you because none of you bargained for an online type course. I hope the adjustments we've had to make, I apologize we had to. I hope they have not been too stressful on you. And I want to give you a little advice. You all have a dream. Don't let anyone or anything steal that dream from you. If people tell you you can't make it, you can't do it, don't listen to them. Tune them out. I don't care who they are. They're no longer worth listening to. You set goals. You set high goals. You do all you can to reach those high goals. And part of that is the genius of America. People that come from disadvantaged backgrounds have made wonderful, wonderful, wonderful contributions to our country. And perhaps, just perhaps, you're going to be the next person to do so. I wish you the best as you continue your academic career. When you leave Chat State, come back and see us sometime. Love to hear from my former students. Love to hear how things are going with them and so on. So please, students, I wish you the best and hope you will continue to be safe during this crisis.